This podcast supports fumigators in improving safety, compliance, and solutions. Always follow the federal fumigant label, state and local laws. Licensed fumigators are legally responsible for their applications. And now, on to All Things Fumigation. Out here, we don't just fight pests. We outsmart them. This is All Things Fumigation, where applied science meets real-world grit. I'm John B. Mueller, a fumigator by trade, and your guide to the science of fumigation done right. Each month, we saddle up with the people, the practices, and the precision it takes to keep facilities safe, compliant, and pest-free. Because when you're in the trenches of pest control, you don't need magic, you need science, and maybe a little cowboy spirit. Smarter solutions, safer practices, managed costs. Welcome to All Things Fumigation. Welcome to another episode of All Things Fumigation. This is episode number 4. And today we'll be covering fumigation preparation. And anybody that knows me, they know I like quotes, help focus a little bit. And the quote today that I think about from a preparation standpoint is one from Michael Jordan that said, "Success comes from hours, weeks, months, years spent preparing for it." And I think that's appropriate from a preparation standpoint when approaching fumigation. We want to thank ScienceCo as our sponsor for episode 4. ScienceCo is the maker of EcoFume and VaporPhos, which is cylinderized phosphine. Last episode, we covered planning for fumigation, and we introduced a common fumigation process. So no matter what type of post-harvest fumigation you're doing, this common process is really the same. It's planning, it's preparation, it's setup, application or introduction of gas, it's analysis or monitoring the fumigation, then ventilation and clearance, and then at the end of that process, we review, and hopefully we review from an optic of a continuous improvement process. And this is a successful fumigation process and pretty time tested. So this week we're looking at preparation. Last week, as we mentioned, it was about planning. So planning is more of a macro perspective on setting the fumigation up for success. Preparation starts to get more granular and really identify more specific roles and responsibilities for the partnership that's leading up to that fumigation event. And preparation is not just a voluntary act, not just good management skills. Fumigation preparation and planning is the label. And anything associated with a pesticide label is federal and state law. And when we think about, approaching the label and how a label functions, we as fumigators all know that these labels are 50, 60 pages long. Some of the longest pesticide labels that I know of. And they're referred to as a product manual. Within that manual, with every fumigant out there is a fumigation management plan. And the reason for that is these labels are very broad. They're general, there's lots of gray areas, and fumigators tended to use those gray areas pretty liberally. The fumigation management plan came in I think, the early 2000s, may have been a little sooner than that, actually. And the fumigation management plan was really designed to take those gray spaces of the label and better define the fumigation event that you're planning for, that you're about to do, and really define that fumigation more tightly. When the FMP first came out, it concerned everyone. We know and we're conditioned that we have to follow the label. we wanted to comply with this new requirement. We approached this, I think most people that I knew at the time, we approached it very tactically. We have this new form. We need to supply that information. And we really did not look at it as an opportunity, I guess, to focus on and develop this successful process that we've described earlier. So it was, basic information, fulfill, only what's been asked for, no more. I think what we've learned, at least here of late, is that this FMP, this fumigation management plan, if integrated into a more cultural approach of planning and preparation, it actually can be helpful in driving successful fumigations. So let's break down a few things with the FMP and its original intent. We're now moving away from the reactive state and really more of an objective view of the FMP. At first, we didn't get great information on what the FMP should look like, so we just started loading this document up with what we thought that EPA wanted. EPA actually asked for 8 very specific things to be a part of a compliant FMP. Let's look at 8 points EPA requires us to consider when forming a compliant fumigation management plan. The statement starts off with the certified applicator is responsible for working with the owners and or responsible employees of the site to be fumigated to develop an FMP. The FMP is intended to ensure a safe and effective fumigation. I think in the beginning it was more about increasing liability for the applicator, and there were many concerns around this document. It wasn't that at all. It was really helping us in terms of identifying safety issues, mitigating those safety issues, and driving effectiveness. There's nothing wrong with either one of those two. They're exactly what we should be doing, and that's what starts to drive the FMP into what should be a cultural success process for fumigators. And it starts to drive the site and the fumigator in partnership. And we'll dig a little deeper. EPA continues to go on and identify and say critical components of a fumigation include the product manual or label and the documentation it creates. So the FMP should be done prior to the fumigation in advance during the planning process and the preparation process. But we also know there are other documentation that is obligatory that is associated with a fumigation. So it speaks to that specific information. We know states require pesticide usage logs, restricted use chemical usage logs, have a little more specificity to it, and that's where documents like that tie into the process. The FMP must address characterization of the site and appropriate monitoring and notification requirements. Appropriate monitoring is the comment there. Appropriate monitoring, believe it or not, is not only safety monitoring for the operator, for the applicator, for the bystander, but it's also efficacy monitoring. And then notification requirements. There are some specifications that EPA later on in the FMP will specifically ask for. If you find this episode helpful, please like us or follow us on the platform you're using. We really appreciate your support. So what we want to do now is to get into the 8 requirements of an FMP. Let's review these in order. The first item that EPA is asking for on an FMP is inspect the site to determine its suitability for fumigation. And really, that should be priority 1. That should be determined at the point of sale or the potential for treating that space. So it's number 1. And for decades, this has been a requirement of fumigators who fumigate bulk vessels, so ships of grain. Suitability is number 1. Specifically, what they're looking for is for safety and effectiveness. Is this structure that you're about to treat, this building, this facility you're going to treat, Can it be treated safely, and can it be treated effectively? If the answer to that is no, it's a no-go, right? If it's yes, you better have a good plan and be very prepared to ensure safety and effectiveness. Point number 2 is when sealing is required, consult previous records for any changes to the structure, potential leaks, and monitoring of occupied and adjacent buildings. This, yet again, has to be done from the optic of safety and effectiveness, right? Sealing is almost always required. It's starting to get into history here, right? Consult previous records for any changes to the structure, potential leaks, and monitoring of occupied and adjacent buildings. They really want us to go back and look at what happened in the past and really have a process of continuing to improve. Number 3, consult with company officials and appropriate employees prior to each fumigation for any existing FMPs, SDSs, applicator manuals, or other relevant safety procedures. Now, again, this gets into history, right? Now it's the documentation history of any fumigations that have gone on there. I highlighted appropriate employees here because it reminds me of kind of a horror situation I was involved with one time. We were treating a facility that had been a larger campus. It had been a corporate processing operation. The different parts of the campus had been sold off. The corporate headquarters was detached from processing. It was now owned by someone else, and the warehouse was owned by another company, and that was detached. It was just the processing facility, and it had been sold off to another food processor, and they had not fumigated for a long time, and there were really no records to speak of. The senior leadership that had called us in wasn't really heavily engaged like we would like. There wasn't a good partnership going on. I felt uneasy that this was a campus before and now it's viewed as a standalone operational facility. I wasn't sure. It just had a feel that maybe there was some connections. And I asked several times if there were any connections between these buildings underground or whatever. And it was no. Finally, the maintenance guy that was assigned to us, he was the last person to leave, right? We didn't have anything for him, but I asked him, are there any connections to any of these other nearby buildings? He said, yeah, I've worked here for 25 years, and there's a tunnel that goes from processing over to the old corporate office complex. And I said, well, is it sealed off? I mean, is it open? He said, well, they made an attempt to seal it, but they didn't do a very good job. So at that point, your heart sinks, right? So I asked him to show me the access to that area, and sure enough, it was not sealed off very well. And what do you do at that point? It's a non-starter. It was shut it down, and we had the facility completely sealed, and there was no way we were going to release gas in that structure knowing, where it was going to go, right? Sealing in this situation was not an option, not even creating a clean air chamber and doing a double seal. Under these circumstances, that was not an option. To plan it long-term and to get consent, that might have been a way to do it, and then to intentionally monitor it. There was a way to make that safe, but not under the circumstances. So great example of something put into place to really prevent, in this case, something that could have been catastrophic. Number 4 is consult company officials in the development of procedures and appropriate safety measures for nearby workers and public personnel who will be in and around the area during fumigation and aeration. Let's think about the context of what that means. Procedures and appropriate safety measures for nearby workers, in and around. If you're a commodity manager, what comes to mind is receiving operators at dump pits or receiving stations. How are they positioned? Can they continue to resume their functions during a fumigation if it's not attached? And I'm thinking of something like a grain bin that is freestanding, not connected, and a safe distance away from the fumigation. We run into this many times. The issue here is the safe distance could be an educated comfort level and acceptance, but the only way to really be sure is to monitor and verify. So monitoring that area between the treatment structure and where an operator is. These are the kinds of things to think about. From a food processing operation, I think about an unattached warehouse. Many times they'll want the warehouse workers to continue if it's a safe distance from a processing area. And really that's up to the licensed fumigator to determine that. But you also have to verify that during the treatment. That's the reason. These people sometimes get nervous, and you put their minds at ease. They should not be worried about their work environment if there's not a reason to. It's our job to verify that they're safe. We should be communicating to them that as well. Many times, we also run into guardhouses, right? Sometimes, thinking of like a flour milling operation, everybody's gone except the guard, or guards are brought in. That can be unsettling, right? Why does everybody else get to leave? And we have to stay here. Communicating with those guards, respecting their role and responsibility, even empowering them a little bit with explaining what we're doing, explaining that we're going to be extremely careful and we're going to watch out for them, and then do that. Take gas readings, monitor areas between the fumigated structure and the guardhouse, even in the guardhouse. So putting their mind at ease and developing a positive relationship with them. They can help us when we need help in terms of security situations in particular. If we disrespect them, they can be a real impediment to an enjoyable weekend, I'll promise you. Number 5 is consult with company officials to develop an appropriate exterior monitoring plan that will confirm that nearby workers and bystanders are not exposed to levels above the allowable limits during application, fumigation, and aeration. This plan must also demonstrate that nearby residents will not be exposed to concentration above the allowable limits. So there's a little bit of redundancy between 4 and 5 here, but there's redundancy obviously for a reason. It starts to also open up bystanders and nearby residents. We have to definitely consider that from a suitability standpoint and from a job management standpoint. And one thing I'll commonly utilize here is Google Earth. I'll get an image of the facility that we're treating, and when we do our pre-planning and even prep, we'll pull those images out with a team that's going to be doing the work. We'll look at the proximity of these areas. We'll make sure that we're all comfortable with what we see. And if we've got questions, then communication takes place. And the other thing that I really encourage is putting eyes on the site. To me, that's really important. Some of you may have salespeople that sell a job and then an operational crew of fumigators that come in to execute the job. And the way the salesperson views proximity of neighbors and the way the impact zone of the fumigators view it can be different. So there needs to be some communication there and some forward planning. Number 6 is consult with company officials to develop procedures for local authorities to notify nearby residents in the event of an emergency. On face value, this is kind of a zinger, right? Like, how do you define the nearby residents? Where do you stop sometimes? And how do you approach them to get their contact information? This is usually easier than it sounds. First of all, you ask the site or the customer if they have an emergency action plan, an EAP, and many times they do. That can then just be part of your FMP. But that is a very defined point that EPA wants to see. Number 7 is confirm the placement of warning placards around the fumigation site as described in fumigation manuals. Now, there's some detail to that, but essentially it's every opening, every point that a person can access. If there are ladders to the roof, those doors on the roof or up top will require placarding. In this case, too, it's very important, I believe, to utilize maps and indicate, the entries that need to be placarded and even number those. If you know that, especially large facilities, if 15 or 20 or 50 placards need to go out, then you need to be able to get back the same amount. So you ensure that none were left on. Leaving a placard on a building is always a bigger deal than just missing a placard. I've seen fumigations that were wonderfully executed, extremely effective, everything done right. and a placard or two were left on, it A, looks sloppy, and B, the person that finds that door that has a hazardous communication device on it, it says that it's dangerous on the inside of that door. And there are likely at that point people in there. And it just starts to crumble the foundation of trust and everything that you've spent a lot of time building. It's a simple step, and it needs to be executed with perfect detail. A pro tip here for everybody is the same people that put the placards out should remove the placards. You shouldn't change that up. They know that path. They may have put those out with a good regimented map, and that same map needs to be used with the number of placards on it, and that same path should be followed. There can always be narrow alleyways where it's easy to miss a door or something like that, and it just can't be done. And one other consideration or word of caution is you need to know in the state that you're fumigating in, that you're licensed in, should only licensed persons place or remove placards. And in several states, that is the case. Think about it. The only way you can remove a placard is if you know it's safe inside. Well, who determines it's safe? It's the licensed fumigator. When those breathing zones are safe, that's when placards are removed. And technically, in many states, because placement of placards and removal of placards are an item of a label, it's a task required by the licensed fumigator. So look that up and make sure that you're on solid ground there. Number 8, the last one, is confirm the required safety equipment is in place and the necessary manpower is available to complete a safe and effective fumigation. And really, what this is saying is only suitable and trained fumigators can wear respiratory protection and operate clearance devices. We can put safety monitors on all employees that are necessary, especially during ventilation. A word of warning, clearance devices should only be used by the licensed fumigator. And from a respiratory protection standpoint, the only people using SCBAs and gas masks should be those that are properly trained, fit tested, and certified in the use of those respiratory devices. Keep that in mind, and that's really where point 8 is, that the right equipment is in place to complete the job safely and to protect the applicators. Our other obligation is that we're properly trained and suited for that. If you find this episode helpful and would like more information, go to thefumco.com. That's THEFUMECO.com. Everything that we've described talks about a lot of collaboration between the site management and the fumigator, whether that's a for-hire fumigation or a DIY fumigation. There has to be collaboration between those who are in charge of the site and those who are in charge of the fumigation. It's critical for managing safety, and it's also critical for driving best outcomes and maximum effectiveness. We talked about how preparation is more granular, so we really want to drive in some more detail on roles and responsibilities of the fumigation team. Let's dig into this a little bit, because a good fumigator in charge never tries to do everything themselves. They divide the workload responsibly. They set expectations and make sure their team is comfortable with the plan. So every week we would always meet, at least 5 days prior to some of our larger fumigations in particular. And I would discuss what we were doing. Even if we've been doing it multiple times a year or year on year for many years, we still reviewed the game plan, so to speak. I always felt, too, an important consideration is really the size or familiarity of the job. I always ask myself, is this a new job for us? Is the service team that we're going to assign to that job not familiar with the site? They haven't done it before? Or is this like a really big job that really taxes us each year? And if the answer to any of those were yes, we would always consider taking the management team to that job for the fumigation execution was going to take place. So the week before, the month before, it all just depended on what was going on. And I know that many times as a cost, you could always build that cost into the job ahead of time. But the way these jobs started out and the flow was always better when we had prepared minds that went to that job. People that were comfortable and familiar with the surroundings, with the site. It wasn't the first time they'd seen it. If they'd done it before, but it was a really large job, they got to look at it with a fresher pair of eyes. Anybody that's ever done a really big, complex fumigation, we usually walk away swearing that we'd never want to do it again. And the second time we do it, it's surprising how smoother it went. It's about familiarity and getting eyes on the job. I'm just a big fan of that. And it really runs right into the culture of an effective FMP, in my opinion. You get to test the early components of that FMP and build more detail. If it's a smaller job and on-site visit is not realistic, an organizational call could be done. If you're going to go on-site, I think it's important to meet with the customer or the site management team to discuss those things, those 8 points on the FMP. Get everybody on the same page. If you can't do it physically on site, then an organizational call, I think, is very important. And then be prepared by listing, roles and responsibilities of the site and the customer. It is critical at that point. And, you're looking for things like what needs to be locked out. Are there construction projects going on? We know that many times during these shutdown periods for fumigation, they try to slip in other construction projects. So what's happening? I had one instance one time where they pulled the roof off one of the areas that we had to fumigate. And because of weather issues, they couldn't get the roof back on. Very unsuitable, right? So being aware of some of these events and being prepared is very important. And then just really discussing any other hazards that have come up. And remember, one of those FMP points is what adjustments have been made to that structure since the last time it was treated, and this is perfect timing for that. The other thing that I like to do is identify the maintenance person. They're usually the person that's in charge of the management of that specific commodity you're treating, or in a food processing operation, it might be the maintenance guy who's assigned, or maintenance person who's assigned to the HVAC systems. And those are very, very important people because we need to know where the shutoff switches are. No one in general is going to turn those fans on for us unless it's set up remotely. Many times, and even when some of the fans are set up for remote activation, we still have some fans that have to be manually activated. Identifying that maintenance person is very important. Meeting them, talking to them, discussing what you need, which is to safely ventilate that gas and quickly, if possible. And then walk around with him, mark those switches, and then make sure that person is meeting with you on the day of fumigation, really the last person to leave, actually. And because what I would do a lot of times is if the last person would leave at 5 o'clock, I would ask to meet with the maintenance person, let's say at 2 or 3 o'clock. The HVAC person. But before that, I would go around and make sure that there was no strange fans on that were turned on or nothing running that was of concern. I would many times get with a team and tell them through the hand radios, has anybody seen anything that's not off? Then that 2 hours, let's say, or 3 hours before the building is turned or the structure is turned over to us, we gave that individual time to make sure that everything was turned off. And then that emergency contact number for that individual can be critical. Another item is, meet with your crew leaders to map out the workflow. Discuss contingent plans. What if it rains in the middle of fumigation? What if there are customers that delay sealing and preparation for the fumigation? Heat slowdowns. If it's supposed to be 100 degrees, that weekend, our team is not going to be working at the same pace as if it was 70, right? Also, if it's extremely cold, it's just harder to get good seals. It's harder to prep the structure. So how are we going to account for that? What are we going to do? What are our contingent plans? And safety must be integrated into each step. Everything that we're talking about has to do with safety. We cannot emphasize that enough. And then who creates and manages the timeline of work? It really should be the fumigator in charge, but I always wanted kind of my left and right hand associate to be mindful of that too. If I got pulled away, if I got injured or something, or I was dealing with a challenge, we needed someone else there to kind of keep things at pace. It's very important because when we get behind and when we start rushing is when people get hurt. It's when we miss things that compromise our effectiveness and our efficacy. And it does take a solid team to make sure that we're staying on track. And, on that timeline, they can be extremely complex, right? When are the lifts, if they're needed, going to be delivered? When are they going to be picked up? We all have pickup horror stories. When is the fumigant going to be delivered? Is it on time? Is there communication? Are there delays? Are we the next stop? So when is that being delivered? And then when are those empties, partials, and unused fulls being picked back up and shipped out of there? Customers don't like them sitting around, after the treatment. So, being efficient on time and having someone assigned to that can be very important. And then we have to be watching for that all out, right? When the last person leaves, it's all us. If there's fans on, if there are conditions of concern that exist, and now there's no one around to address things that could compromise safety or effectiveness, we have to be watching for that. That cannot creep up on us. The clearance and return of the building. Are we on time from a ventilation standpoint? Are we tracking? Who is responsible for managing that timeline? And then the other thing in advance from a preparation standpoint that I was always big on is I didn't like it when we just kind of popped up and did a safety briefing, right? Everybody be careful, you're on the roof, don't fall. You're on ladders, don't fall. There's generally so much situational consideration, so many points that we need to address. Like we said before, hot, cold, ice. We're on the roof. The roof can be 120 degrees. In the winter, there can be water on the roof and ice. Same issues with ladders and moving transports and train exchanges and semis and forklift drivers. There are so many issues that we need to really touch base with our team. And is our safety briefing, our pre-work safety briefing, is it thoughtful, complete, and prepared? We talked earlier about, safety hazards and construction and things like that. That all needs to be built in, and call-outs need to be made. And a pre-planned safety briefing is extremely important. And then another thing that's overlooked as we kind of start to close down a little bit here on this episode, one thing that I'm big on and that I encourage people to build into their preparation process is on-site training, right? As leaders, it's our job to develop these individuals. They can study for state fumigation tests, are designed to give them information on safety awareness. And there's stewardship training that go over some other helpful safety enhancements and processes. But really, we need to build in some sort of apprentice element. When we're on site, we do have an opportunity to think about those associates who are really showing promise and start to expose them to different aspects and different functions within a job. Can they take a small crew and be assigned a section of the roof for sealing or ground level sealing or something like that, and be given a little responsibility? If they're to the point of they're running the seal crew and they're doing a good job and they need a challenge, bring them in to help set up gas applications and monitoring stations, assign deliveries and placement of gas. And there's all sorts of elements to a fumigation that you can list in the style of post-harvest fumigations that you do. And really expose these associates to these different elements. And it's part of, being able to trust and divide the workload so that you, as the fumigator in charge, don't have to feel like you have to do everything. I think that's something that's missed a lot, and I really want to encourage. One other step is notifying emergency responders. This is not something that should be done 5 minutes before we're about to release gas. This is something that should be part of the preparation process. And how are you notifying police and fire? Are you calling them to give them the date? Are you sending them SDS and labels that have the note to the physician, which is very important and sometimes difficult to access if there's an issue? And there is a third element that I think is a very good idea, not part of the label, but I think, these are our friends we're working with. These are our friends we're working for. And if someone is injured, especially related to a fumigant, that trauma center, that emergency room probably does not have a lot of experience with what we're doing. Providing the SDS and note to physician to the head nurse for the responding emergency room for the facility that we're working at is a very, very useful and important attribute. So find out from the site what hospital responds to emergencies that occur at that location, and it's very simple. And every time I've ever done this, they are always extremely appreciative, and it could make a very large impact. So we're going to wrap up here. The last point I want to make from a preparation standpoint is really just mental preparation for some of these jobs. It may sound goofy, but I visualize a job. If I'm nervous about a complicated job or something, some aspect of that fumigation troubles me, I start to walk through in my head what it looks like when we arrive, who we need to talk to. Are there other people we need to talk to? Where do we go? Where are we going to pull up and park our vehicles respectfully? Where are we going to discharge our gear? I'm big on getting there a half a day early and getting everything set up. Some of the stuff that we have is extremely heavy. And the last thing you want to do is show up early in the morning and stress your crew out by getting things in place and up on roofs and things like that. And now they have to start work and they're beat. Get that done the day before. Everybody gets to see the facility, gets familiar with it, gets set up, you're prepared, you're organized. I think about things like that. I think about how to orient the timeline. If I'm concerned about rain coming, I think about what do I do? I will save interior tasks for the last step in case there's a rain delay, because we can seal inside. You can't seal outside in the rain. So all kinds of things. I will literally go through each step of that fumigation and think about what could go wrong and what I would do if it did. And really it kind of comes from, and I found a quote again from Michael Jordan here that says, I visualize where I want to be, what kind of player I want to become. I know exactly where I want to go, and I focus on getting there. And I think if you look at successful people, they are visualizing as fumigators out in the field. So as I like to end these episodes with a final message, I'll include preparation, right? Be prepared, be deeply, granularly prepared for these fumigations in advance, be well communicated. It's very difficult to over-communicate. It's very easy to under-communicate. We talked about the importance of visualization and visualizing success. We want everybody to be a science cowboy, apply the science, and protect your product. We want to have a big thanks to our sponsor, ScienceCo. And we also would like to remind you that we want feedback from you on the content of these episodes. We'd like suggestions for future programming, and it's very helpful to us. And we may use some of that feedback in future episodes. If you like what you've heard here today, please follow us, like us on your platforms. And if you'd like more information, visit us at thefumco.com. Until next time, Science Cowboys, I am John B. Mueller, and this is All Things Fumigation.